All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Winnebago County Board meeting. Tonight is Thursday, October 14th, 2021. And our invocation and pledge of allegiance this evening will be given by board member Steve Schultz. Everyone stand, please.
Dear God, we're grateful to be here. We're always at our best when we listen to and honor and follow your ways. We thank you for your presence. We thank you for your power and your goodness. We thank you for Christ and what he means to each of us, what he's done in our behalf. Pray that you will be with us because we need you. We need your wisdom. We need your understanding. We put our hope and our confidence in you. And we pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Pledge allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Thompson, is there any agenda announcements this evening?
No, Mr. Chairman. You'll be taking up the motion after the roll call?
Yes.
Yes.
Will do. All right. Clerk Gummow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. McCarthy, Mr. McDonald, Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado, Mr. Schultz, Mr. Tassoni, Mr. Webster, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Arena, Mr. Billich, Mr. Booker, Mr. Butita, Mrs. Crosby, Ms. Fellers, Mr. Gurl, Mrs. Gorel, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Lindmark, Mr. Chairman, 16 board members present, 4 board members absent.
We did. We do have a quorum. Mr. McCarthy.
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to allow Angela Fellers and Brad Lindmark remote access to attend tonight's meeting.
Very good. Do we have a second? Mr. Arena seconds that motion. Is there any discussion on the motion? Are there any board members opposed to that motion? Very good. Please mark all members present a yes. You can count who's still available. Very good. Okay, we'll move on at this point to awards, presentations, public hearings, and public participation. So there are no awards this evening. We do have a presentation this evening by Taryn Marco, and I believe Deb Jarvis is coming forward to present on juvenile probation programs.
Of Court Services here in the 17th Circuit. So I'm the Director of Court Services for both Boone and Winnebago County. As you can see on our little slideshow that we have presented here, I just wanted to give you a real quick overview of what Court Services means. We have 5 different divisions within our Court Services: the Adult Probation Department, Pretrial Services, Juvenile Detention, Juvenile Probation, and the Resource Intervention Center. So I'm extremely thankful for all of you being able to give us the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what we do in court services. Tonight, I'm going to highlight our Juvenile Probation Department and the services that we offer within that department. And then in 2 weeks, I will be back to join you again to talk about our Resource Intervention Center. So I'm going to introduce for you now Taryn Marco. She is our director of the Juvenile Probation Department. She's been the director in that department for approximately 2 years, but she's been with our department here in Winnebago since 2004. So she's certainly not new to Winnebago County. So Taryn Marco is going to take over and talk to you about what we do in juvenile probation.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing us to come and highlight some of our programming. Move on. So our Winnebago County Juvenile Probation Department consists of 17 officers, and we have a variety of different programming ranging from our Juvenile Assessment Center to our field unit, which includes our school-based probation, our intensive probation unit, our juvenile redeploy program, and our youth recovery court, which is our juvenile problem-solving court program. I'll go into a little bit of detail about each of those programs as we go, but I wanted to start off and tell you a little bit about the population that we serve. We work with kids ordered to supervision all the way up till their 21st birthday. However, they must be adjudicated on offense before they turn 18. Now, the kids that come through our detention center have to be at least 10 years old in order to come to work with us. So we work with a wide range of youth from 10 all the way up to 21. Now, our assessment center is designed as a law enforcement drop-off center. And this is often the first entry point for kids arrested in Winnebago County. We have trained probation officers that work with kids that are arrested anywhere in Winnebago County during our operating hours, Monday through Friday, from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Officers will bring kids to our center, and our probation officers will then assume custody for them. They will complete the full booking process, including conducting risk assessments and detention screens, and then finding resolution for our kids when detention is not necessary. Our probation officers work with these kids at the time of their arrest, will make recommendations to the state's attorney's office, and come to a resolution where they should go next if they are not screened into our detention center. Not only do our officers work with kids at the time of the arrest, they also work with kids that are runaways or are locked out of the home. We work and make referrals to local programs in the area, diversion programs, and other community resources to help that family resolve any issue that they may be dealing with at that point. Now, when a youth is ordered to supervision or ordered onto probation, that's when they are assigned to one of our 17 probation officers. Each individual completes a juvenile risk assessment where their risk level is determined on whether they are more likely to commit a new crime. Our officers will then develop a case plan with each individual and target those areas to help them increase their supports in the community and figure out ways to connect them to local community resources. I started this presentation talking about some of our highlighted programs. Well, one of those is our intensive probation unit. Our intensive probation department works with the high-risk youth in our community. The emphasis here is on a higher priority of community safety, and we accomplish that through increased contact, curfews, and use of in-home confinement. But it's all on a level system where the kids can work and earn and achieve their milestones and earn their way off of such a high level of supervision. We also have our juvenile redeploy program. This is focused on working with moderate to high-risk youth through utilizing 2 designated redeploy officers that work in conjunction with Youth Service Network's caseworkers. They provide the youth and family with wraparound services, addressing issues in the home, teaching pro-social thinking skills, and providing cognitive behavioral therapies, as well as school advocacy. Our Youth Recovery Court program is a full team effort. It's a problem-solving court program where we have a designated probation officer working with moderate to high-risk youth, aged 10 to 17 years old, charged with nonviolent offenses, who are dealing with both mental health issues and co-occurring orders. So this is a program where we're working closely with Rosecrans for their substance abuse programming as well as their mental health support. This year has been a new year for us. We've implemented quite a few new initiatives through juvenile probation. Our first one was a diversion program aimed for those arrested, first-time offenders arrested on a domestic battery charge or with a history of domestic violence in the home. This was a program, a 21-week curriculum, working alongside with the parent to come to work with our officers and learn ways to communicate together and address their needs. We've also re-engaged internal programming for our kids on probation. We started with aggression replacement training, which is a cognitive behavioral program targeting moderate to high-risk kids, and it consists of anger control training, social skill building, and moral reasoning training in an effort to promote future pro-social behavior and ultimately reduce recidivism. We're also taking active steps to increase programming for our kids. We have a dedicated officer to facilitate cognitive behavioral programs to both out-of-custody kids, those on probation or on supervision, as well as those in our detention center. So this is a brand new initiative for us, and we're developing that as we speak, researching programs that would be appropriate for that population. So I went really fast and told you a little bit about a lot of different things, but I'd love to answer any of your questions that you may have.
Are there any questions? Mr. Webster?
Yeah, I'm just curious, for each one of your probation officers, average, how many clients do they have?
On average, they're serving about 30 children. Some a little bit more. Some of our high-risk populations have a smaller caseload, so they can designate the time required to them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, Ms. Red.
Thank you, Chairman. Oh, a couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to visit the Juvenile Probation Office. I would also like to visit the detention center, if you can arrange that for the county board members to visit. All right, thank you.
Ms. Gorel?
Too visited the juvenile home. You know, our board members who didn't go to that really need to attend it. I know it's hard because many of you are working, but you have no idea how hard they are working with the youth there. And it's something that has been wanted and needed for a long period of time. If I'm correct, some of that half a cent mental health tax that went through, you are taking advantage of that, are you not?
Yeah. Actually, we are not currently, but that is something that we've been partnering with Marlena to look at applying for next year. We would like to be able to bring in an outside agency to provide more intensive services for those juveniles. As I'll speak to in 2 weeks, we have what's called the Resource Intervention Center for our adults. It's a one-stop shop, very encompassing programming for the adults. We want to do that for our juveniles also. Taryn has done an excellent job with her staff in getting us going on that and getting some programming, but we need more. We need more at our detention center, and we need more in the probation center. So that's what we're hoping to partner with Marlena and write up a really great application to try and get money for that.
I just want to go back for a minute. I was so impressed. I didn't realize, because I'm not involved, I don't realize how hard you girls work, and the parole officers didn't realize how many children you're taking care of, because we have so many children in need that if we don't take care of them now, we're going to have big problems down the line. And the other thing, I'm happy to see that some of these programs, you're also working with the parent or the guardian of this child to give them at least a head start, because many of these children down the line are the ones who are going to be doing suicides. They're the ones that are going to be selling drugs on the street. And if we can prevent that now, I just take my hats off to all of you there. We're trying to work with these young people to keep them out of trouble and show them the right way to, they're never going to live the way you and I do, don't expect them to, but to show them that there is a street out there that they can follow and come out to be really good citizens and have a future. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually have two questions. One, do you know statistically what the trends have been based on your probation, the juveniles coming in and out of your office? Have you seen that as an increase, decrease, or it's maintained about the same level on that aspect? So that's the number one question that I have. The second question I have is, what about the juveniles that may not have a home, like that you may have to do a curfew, et cetera, et cetera? How do you work with that? And finally, I do echo Ms. Squirrel, is that you do need to reach out to the mental health tax individuals at Regional Plan 1, get some grant funding of some sort to, help with that, the mental illness. Hopefully, that could subside and provide some funding. So if I could just get those answers or thoughts, comments.
For your first question, are you asking about the number of arrests or the number of recidivism rates?
I mean, both, if you can provide, I'm not asking for like hard facts or statistics, but what the trends are right now.
Well, COVID has been a challenge for us. We have seen a decrease in arrests coming through our assessment center. Therefore, there's a decrease in kids through our court system as well. However, since school started this year, those arrests have increased. I can pull some data for you if you're interested, and I'd be happy to share those numbers for you with the number of cases coming through. I can pull that for you.
And I think it's important to know, even though perhaps the numbers were down a little last year as far as the total number of kids, the kids that we see here in Winnebago and that we bring in, by the time they're in the court system, they've got significant issues. I've had some experience in a smaller community before coming here, and it's a different population. It's a whole different world in what we're dealing with here than in some other areas. So even if our numbers are a little lower than maybe they were 2 years ago, we need to provide more services. I think our kids are higher risk and higher need than they have ever been before.
And I think we're seeing that with the effect that the community has seen on our local programming and some of the resources that have had to shut their doors because of different things that have happened. There are less programs to refer families to early on. So we are seeing that through the kids that are ordered to coming through probation stores.
Which is in part why we started to look at doing more services in-house and why we're looking at that mental health tax as well, so that we don't have to keep reaching out to all the community resources where they're already full or they're close the door, that kind of thing. We need to do that more in-house to take care of our problems.
I'll come back to Mr. Neighbors.
So you said that when school was in session, the arrest rate for children went up. I have an issue with a school in my area where arrest rate is out of control at the school. And so I was going to speak to the school board to see what they could do to decrease that arrest rate. I was wondering, are you all working with the school district and asking the school district to see what they can do to help decrease that arrest rate? Because it seems like could be something also in the schools that the schools could be doing to help decrease that trend.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The school is offering a few different programs. We have our officers, we have four probation officers housed in the local Rockford high schools. And we also have an officer dedicated to the Harlem High School. And what's unique about that is those officers get to know the administrators, the counselors, the school staff, so that when a child that they are working with is struggling on an issue, there's a point person immediately for them to communicate and to work with. However, that's not helping arrests at the forefront. This is coming in after the arrest has been made. The Rockford School District does have a youth court program that they have utilized the last 5 or 6 years, in which misdemeanor offenses, certain offenses, instead of being arrested for, they issue notice to appears, and they are eligible to complete the youth court program. Now, that's a program, as you would kind of infer from the name, in where there is a panel of students that hear the situation, hear the case, and then set up different recommendations, including public service work, some restorative justice issues are offered there, so that those kids are not brought through the justice system as kind of a diversion program, if you will. So that's just two of the programs that the school is providing right now that I can share about.
Okay. Ms. Red?
You mentioned that you have 17 probation officers. How many of those are minorities?
Not a lot. We have one.
One.
Two. Two. We have two.
Two. Okay, thank you.
Three.
As we go through them in our mind.
We also have openings as well, so if you know anyone looking for a job, please come to juvenile probation.
Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I was wondering, what is considered full staff for probation officers? You're at 17. What would be full staff?
17 would be our full-time positions for field officers. We also have
How many openings are there?
one.
Juvenile. Two in juvenile. Yeah, you're right. 2 in juvenile, 2 in adult, 2 in our pretrial department, and 4 at detention.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question has to do with, we get citizens that approach us and ask this question, or it's also on social media, that when kids are arrested, rearrested, and they're constantly through the system, when can the courts start filing charges on the parents? Because this kid isn't following the rules, the parameters that are set by the juvenile court, and the parents are willful indifference, just not being a part of the program. So a lot of citizens wonder, when are we going to start arresting the parents for some of these kids' crimes? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. Is there any other questions? Ms. Squirrel.
I guess my question to that is, how many of those parents are already in jail and they're not with their children? Would you like to answer that one for me?
There would be a portion of those who could be incarcerated. We certainly try and work with the family unit as a whole, but in the end, we're really working also on the juvenile and their thinking. We're really trying to get to their thinking patterns and how they think, so that even if a parent perhaps is not present, that we can help them make some better choices.
Because so many of these parents have their own problems. And I know a couple where the parent is bipolar. And so it just kind of trickles down to their children. And as far as I'm concerned, and that's me because I'm a mother, I just feel that we should have more individual care for those children, especially if they're acting out because of the parent. And there should be more hands-on and follow and more assessment management with those children who come from dysfunctional homes to begin with, so that we can give them help to keep them out of trouble. So we need to look beyond the child. We need to look at who is raising that child, what has that child seen in their life, how many shootings have they been at, why are they in this position, and then go from that point forward and then see, because we can arrest all the parents we want, but half of them might be in jail. We don't know. We don't know who that parent is. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Neighbors.
Just wanted to make a comment as far as when they approached the mental health board for money for funding. Just keep in mind, the mental health board is looking for, is trying to fill the gap. So when you get ready to approach the mental health board, we need a program that's innovative and not the same thing as what you're already doing. And so that may help when you get ready to ask for funding. Just bring a new program that can help fill the gaps that we're looking to fill at the mental health board.
Thank you. We'll keep that in mind.
Thank you, Mr. Neighbors. Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Taryn, and thank you, Deb.
You're welcome. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, is Mr. Brad Roos in attendance for public participation? I don't see Mr. Roos. Okay. All right, we'll move on then from that. So we'll move on to our proclamation. All right, Tammy, you want to come forward? All right, I'm going to read this proclamation. And Tammy Stanley's here from the Sheriff's Department to receive the proclamation. So this proclamation is in recognition of Week Without Violence, October 18th through the 23rd, 2021. Whereas women and girls face interlocking and compounding social barriers, including racism, sexism, and gender-based violence. And whereas violence against women impacts the lives of countless women and their families across the United States, with 1 in 4 women experiencing domestic violence and more than 4 women murdered each day by their current or former partner. And whereas every 90 seconds an American is sexually assaulted, and out of every 100 cases of rape, only 57 lead to an arrest. 11 are referred to prosecutors, and 7 lead to a felony conviction. And whereas financial abuse is experienced in up to 99% of domestic violence cases and occurs all across socioeconomic, educational, and racial and ethnic groups. And whereas immigrant women, women of color, women with disabilities, LGBTQ communities face heightened risk of violence and greater barriers to legal remedies and supportive services. And whereas 1 of every 4 homeless women is homeless because of the violence committed against her. And over 90% of homeless mothers have experienced severe physical and/or sexual abuse during their lifetime. And whereas the community of Winnebago County, Illinois, will work to end the epidemic of gender-based violence and offer support to families. Now therefore, be it resolved, I, Joseph V. Shirelli, Chairman of the Winnebago County Board, do hereby proclaim October 18th through the 23rd, 2021 as YWCA Northwestern Illinois Week Without Violence in Winnebago County, and encourage all citizens to rally support for all individuals affected by sexual assault or physical violence.
I just want to say a few words. Thank you to the chairman, the board, and the community for recognizing this important week-long observance. This year, the YWCA is partnering with the Winnebago County Sheriff's Office. That's why I'm here. I work for the Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, but also I am a YWCA board member. So I'm accepting this proclamation on their behalf tonight. And the YWCA is also partnering with the Chairman's Office and the State's Attorney's Office for this week-long Week Without Violence, which starts on October 18th. During this week, the YWCA is creating chalk drawings at the Criminal Justice Center, the Administration Building, and the Public Safety Building. We're calling it Chalk Up to Awareness. What that is doing is raising awareness about gender-based violence and the issues that survivors face. I know you already shared a few statistics, but I can just share a few more. 1 in 3 women are a victim of physical, verbal, or emotional abuse in the United States. 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence, and on average, more than 3 women are murdered by their current or former partners in the United States every day. 81% of all women have experienced harassment, 51 have been sexually touched, and 27 have survived sexual assault. I just want to remind everyone that domestic violence doesn't end when October hits. I just want to thank you again for the proclamation and for your time this evening. Thank you. All right, thanks.
Okay, we'll move on. Our agenda number 6 is the approval of the minutes. Can I entertain a motion to approve the minutes of September 9th, 2021 and lay over the September 30th, 2021 minutes? This motion's made by Mr. Neighbors and Mr. Village seconds that motion. Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, Clerk Gumma, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. McDonald, Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado, Mr. Schultz, Mr. Webster, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Arena, Mr. Billich, Mr. Booker, Mr. Butita, Mrs. Crosby, Mrs. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Gurl, Mrs. Gorel, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Kelly, Mr.
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy, Mr. Chairman, that is 19 yes, 1 board member absent.
Thank you. Motion has been approved. Move on to number 7 is the consent agenda. Can I entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda, please? Mr. Village motions. Ms. Crosby seconds that motion. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, Clerk Gummo, can you please call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado, Mr. Schultz, Mr. Webster, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Arena, Mr. Billich, Mr. Booker, Mr. Butita, Mrs. Crosby, Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Gurl, Mrs. Gorel, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy, Mr. McDonald. Mr. Chairman, that is 19 yes, 1 board member absent.
Very good. The consent agenda has been approved. Move on to number 8 on our agenda is the appointments. Per county board rules, board chairman appointments require a 30-day layover unless there is suspension of the rule. The first is Howard Union Cemetery Association. The compensation is none. We have 3 reappointments. The first is Sherry Fagerstrom, Joe Albertstedt, and Ken Moore. Those are all 3 reappointments. Second category is the 12 Mile Grove Cemetery Association. The compensation is none, and that is for Carrie Daly, and that is a new appointment to the 12 Mile Grove Cemetery Association. Those will be laid over for 30 days. Okay, we'll move on to number 9 of the reports of standing committees. First committee is the Finance Committee from Mr. Salgado.
Mr. Chairman, if I can take this opportunity to remind the board members, since we are conducting a Zoom meeting, to please speak clearly and loudly into the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Finance Committee has 17 items today, but I'd like to take the ordinances for the levy as one lump sum. That would be item 2 to 14, and I'll read them in, and I'd like to motion for those. So the first one's ordinance to authorize the levy property tax fiscal year 2022 for the general fund. Second one's ordinance to authorize levy of property taxes in fiscal year 2022 for IMRF fund. Ordinance to authorize a levy property taxes in the fiscal year 2022 for the highway fund. Ordinance to authorize a levy for property taxes fiscal year 2022, the county bridge fund. Ordinance to authorize levy property taxes in fiscal year 2022 for federal aid matching fund. Ordinance to authorize levy of property taxes in fiscal year 2022 for the Health Department Fund. Ordinance to authorize levy for property taxes of fiscal year 2022 for the Tort Judgment and Liability Fund. The next one is ordinance to authorize levy of property taxes in fiscal year 2022 for Social Security Fund. The next one is the ordinance to authorize levy of property taxes in fiscal year 2022 for the Veterans Assistance Fund. The next one is the ordinance to authorize levy property taxes in fiscal year 2022 for the Detention Home Fund. The next one is the ordinance to authorize the levy property taxes in fiscal year 2022 for the Historical Museum Fund. And the next one is ordinance to authorize levy property taxes in fiscal year 2022, the Nursing Home Operation Fund. And finally, the ordinance to authorize the levy property tax in fiscal year 2022 for the Children's Advocacy Fund, and I so move.
Very good. We have a motion by Mr. Salgado, a second by Mr. Huffman. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quickly, this is just pretty standard based on our budget. Mr. Rickard has provided this information as part of the budget. These are just the allocations from the tax levies that we collect. So that's pretty much it.
Very good. Is there any discussion from board members about anything to do with items 2 through 14 in the ordinances? Okay. Hearing none. Clerk Gamal, can you please call the roll on item 2 through 14?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mrs. Red. Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Schultz? Mr. Webster? Mr. Westcott? Mr. Arena? Mr. Billich? Mr. Booker? Mr. Butita? Mrs. Crosby? Ms. Fellers?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl? Mrs. Gorel? Mr. Hoffman? Mr. Kelly? Mr. Lindmark?
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy? Mr. McDonald? Mr. Neighbors? Mr. Chairman, that is 18 yes, 1 board member no, and 1 board member absent.
Very good. The motions have been approved. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is a resolution to adjust the salary of the public defender, and I so move.
Motion by Mr. Salgado. Is there a second? Mr. Booker seconds that motion. Mr. Salgado.
Yes, just real quickly, this is 90% of the state's attorney's salary, which is about $165,090.76. This is essentially for the public defender, something we do on a yearly basis from the state. So we have to make sure that public defender, he has an adjustment based on the state's attorney's 90% salary.
Very good. Thank you. Is there any discussion? Item 15. All right, hearing none. Clerk Gamal, can you please call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Salgado.
Yes.
Mr. Schultz. Mr. Tassoni is absent. Mr. Webster. Mr. Westcott. Mr. Arena. Mr. Billich. Mr. Booker. Mr. Butita. Mrs. Crosby. Ms. Fellers.
Yes.
Mr. Gurl. Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Hoffman. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Lindmark.
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy. Mr. McDonald. Mr. Neighbors. Mrs. Red. Mr. Chairman, 19 board members yes, 1 board member absent.
Very good. The resolution has been approved. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Shirali and Chairman. Next item is a resolution awarding the bid for patio and sidewalk replacement work at River Bluff Nursing Home, and it's in about $307,100, and I so move.
Mr. Salgado motions to approve. Is there a second? Yes, we've got Bert Girl. Very good. Is there any discussion, Mr. Salgado?
Yes, just real quickly on this one, and Ann Johns, maybe she could answer this or elaborate a little bit. Just want to let you guys know that they selected the the best bidder on this process, Shulstrom, and it looks like there was some contingency fee that was increased based on when the quote came out. It was a little bit less than what it is, so I just want to make sure that everybody's aware that there was some contingency in there. I don't know exactly the percentage, but I just want to let you guys know that they selected the best bidder on this, but taking into account that there is a contingency fund out there, some of the funds were used for that. So I just want to make everybody aware of that.
Very good. Is there any other discussion? Item number 16. Hearing none. Clerk Gummow, can you please call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Schultz, Mr. Webster, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Arena, Mr. Billich, Mr. Booker, Mr. Butita, Mrs. Crosby, Ms. Fellers.
Yes.
Mr. Gurl, Mrs. Gorel, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Lindmark.
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy, Mr. McDonald, Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, that is 19 board members yes, 1 board member absent.
Okay, the resolution has been approved. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to lump 17 and 18 together as they're related. I'll read them in and then I'll move on them. The first one is a resolution awarding the county clerk COVID-19 imaging project. That's in the amount of $1,189,391.70. The second one is a resolution awarding the recorder COVID-19 imaging project in the amount of $281,705.83, and I so move.
Very good. Mr. Salgado moves to approve. Do I have a second? Ms. Gorel seconds that motion.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, there were some questions brought up at caucus. I just want to address those. One of the questions was basically, and Ms. Gomau's here in case she wants to elaborate a little bit. One of the questions was about the birth certificates. If it's our property, our files are going to stay within our facility, and the answer is yes to Ms. Gomau. I did have a conversation with her. They are coming on sites doing the scanning for us and everything, but the files and everything is the property of Winnebago County, particular for birth certificates, marriage license. When they are going to order anything online, and that's the hope in the future, is to do that. Marriage certificates, if I misspeak, Ms. Gomau, please stop me. Sometimes they have to be sealed and stamped, so therefore they would have to come in and do that process as well. But there is going to be a fee that we will be charging for that. So just for everybody to understand that. And I believe those were the two questions, with all the legacy cost. There is going to be legacy costs going forward, but it's going to be absorbed within the recorder piece of it, and obviously the clerk's office as well. So there is going to be available to absorb some of the costs, the legacy costs going for the software maintenance piece of that going forward. So the big chunk right now is just making sure that we can get everything scanned and imaged within our system and get the system going. So I know those were the two questions at caucus, so I just wanted to address those.
Yes, Ms. Red.
Thank you, Chairman. Do we know what it would cost to purchase a birth certificate and the marriage license online?
I don't have that answer, but Ms. Gomau.
Ms. Gomau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Birth certificates are $17 for the first copy, $5 for any additional copy. Marriage licenses are the same. Death certificates are $21 for the first copy, $9 for any additional copy. We take cash, we take check. If you use a credit card, there's a $2.50 processing fee.
So if we go to the new system, it will be the same price?
It's the same price. Where now, if you order it online, there is a $10 processing fee, but you can come into our office at any time to get those documents.
Thank you.
Very good. Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Ms. Fellers.
I actually have two quick questions. The first one is, where will the files be stored? Will they be stored on Winnebago County servers, or are they being stored by a third party?
They'll be stored by a third party, and we had the IT department review their proposal, and it was the IT's recommendation that we go with a third party.
Okay, and then my second question is, what kind of format will they be stored in? Is it one that could go to another company to store it, or another kind of server to store it, or is it proprietary to the software that we're purchasing for this project?
The files that we are having done work in tandem with our vendor, and it was very specific, the types of files that we have, so they can be utilized with our software. So again, it was very specific to the programs that we were using. So
okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
That answers my question, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Hearing and seeing none, Clerk Gamow, can you please call the roll?
I would be glad to, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. We'll start with Mr. Webster, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Arena, Mr. Billich, Mr. Booker, Mr. Butita, Mrs. Crosby, Ms. Fellers.
Yes.
Mr. Gurl, Mrs. Gorel, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Lindmark.
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy, Mr. McDonald, Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to report we have 19 yes and 1 absent.
Very good report, Ms. Gamow. Both resolutions have been approved.
And that
Mr.
concludes our
Salgado.
report.
Very
Thank you very
good,
much.
thank you. All right, we'll move on to 9B is our zoning committee, and Mr. Webster.
Thank you. So it won't take long. This has already been read in for the first reading, so we're going to vote on this evening. This is for zoning in District 1. It's for the record, it's Z0521. And I would move to approve.
All right, Mr. Webster moves to approve, and Mr. Billich seconds that motion. Is there any discussion, Mr. Webster?
Not on my part.
Not on Mr. Webster's part. Any other board member discussion? All right, hearing seeing none, Clerk Gamow, can you please call the roll?
We start with Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott, Mr. Arena, Mr. Billich, Mr. Booker, Mr. Butita, Mrs. Crosby, Ms. Fellers.
Yes.
Mr. Gurl, Mrs. Gorel, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy, Mr. McDonald, Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Chairman, that is 19 board members yes and 1 board member absent.
Very good. The zoning map amendment has been approved. Mr.
Thank you.
Webster, thank you.
That's all we have.
All righty. We'll move on to Economic Development Committee. Mr. Jazz Billich.
We have no report.
Very good, thank you. We will now move on to Operations and Administrative Committee. Mr. Keith McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Operations Committee has 3 resolutions for this evening. The first is a resolution authorizing the execution. I can't read today. I'm trying to hurry up and move things along. A resolution authorizing the execution of a renewal agreement with AmWinds Group Benefits for the administration of a retiree medical and prescription plan, and I so move.
Motion to approve by Mr. McDonald. Mr. Webster seconds that motion. Mr. McDonald. Any discussion? Any discussion from the board members? All right, hearing and seeing none, Clerk Gamow, can you please call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Westcott, Mr. Arena, Mr. Billich, Mr. Booker, Mr. Butita, Mrs. Crosby, Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Gurl, Mrs. Gorel, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy, Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado, Mr. Schultz, Mr. Tassoni is still absent, Mr. Webster. That is 19 board members yes, 1 board member absent, Mr. Chairman.
The resolution has been approved. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next resolution authorizing the execution of a renewal agreement with Northern Illinois Health Plans for third-party administrative services, and I so move.
Motion to approve by Mr. McDonald. Ms. Red seconds that motion. Any discussion? All right, hearing none. Clerk Gummo, can you please call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Arena, Mr. Billich, Mr. Booker, Mr. Butita, Mrs. Crosby, Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Gurl, Mrs. Gorel, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy, Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado, Mr. Schultz, Mr. Webster, Mr. Westcott. Chairman, that is 19 board members yes, 1 absent.
Resolution has been approved. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next resolution adopting revised language for the discrimination harassment policy, diversity policy, and equal opportunity policy. And I would make a motion to send this back to committee based on a lively conversation that we had in caucus. I think we're not quite ready for this.
Okay, we have a motion to send this item back to, you should say caucus?
Committee.
Committee. Very good. Send this back to committee. And a second by Mr. Webster. Is there any discussion on that motion? Hearing none, Clerk Gummo, can you, Ms. Gorel.
As I'm looking at these, have our legal looked over the policies we now have so we know what type of changes need to be made and they can advise us on that? It would probably make it a much shorter, looking at, otherwise this could go on for months of us changing and looking and whatever. So if your people can take a good look at all of these policies and see where we really need to change them and update them, that would be really much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gorel. Any other questions? Clerk Gummo, can you please call the roll on that motion to send that back to committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll start with Mr. Billich.
Yes.
Mr. Booker, Mr. Butita, Mrs. Crosby, Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Gurl, Mrs. Gorel, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy, Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado, Mr. Schultz, Mr. Webster, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Arena. Mr. Chairman, that is 19 board members yes, 1 board member absent.
Very good. The motion is approved. Mr. McDonald?
Do you have a question?
Yes, may I suggest only one thing? Does this just pertain to the administration building, or does this go to all departments, like the sheriff's department, the health department? Or is this just for this building, only? I'd like to know how many, if it's a regular policy, or how many policies we need to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. The policy would apply to all Winnebago County employees, including elected officials.
Thank you. Mr. McDonald?
That concludes the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. So we have 9E is Public Works Committee. Is there a report for Public Works this evening? No report from Public Works. All right, how about Public Safety and Judiciary Committee? Mr. Billich. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No report.
No report. Very good. Okay, we'll move on to number 10 is unfinished business. 10A is the Cherry Valley Cemetery Association. Compensation is none. The appointment is for Patricia Campbell, that's a reappointment, and David White, which is also a reappointment. And then we have the Durand Sanitary District. The compensation is $500 a year, and that is for Kenneth Gibbler. Can I have a motion for those two appointments? Mr. Billich makes a motion, and Ms. Crosby seconds the motion to approve 10A and 10B. Is there any discussion on those appointments? Hearing none. Clerk Gumbel, can you please call the roll for 10A and B?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Booker, Mr. Butita, Mrs. Crosby, Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Gurl, Mrs. Gurl, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy, Mr. McDonald, Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado, Mr. Schultz, Mr. Webster, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Arena, Mr. Billich. Mr. Chairman, 19 board members yes, 1 board member absent.
Good, the appointments have been approved. Number 11 is new business. Is there any new business in front of the board this evening? Mr. Webster.
I don't know whether you want it under new business or announcements, but Mr. McDonald reminded me on the way in tonight, asked me if I was going to promote a sock drive again this year for Carpenter's Place. Most of you know I've done this for several years now, and so this time of year, and that's the most needed thing they have for the people they serve there generally. That's how this came about a few years ago when they sent an announcement. So I'd like to continue doing that tradition, and I'll bring a large tub in and put it over there behind Mr. Booker. And then if you can donate some new socks or gloves, throw them in that tub, and we'll deliver them to Carpenter's Place in November, right before or after Thanksgiving. And I'd appreciate all of your involvement in that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we can get the communications director to send a notice to every county board member and county employee about that, Mr. Webster.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, if you want to just give the details when you will do it to Danielle, and we're happy to post that. Perfect.
Thanks.
The great thing that you've been doing. You must remind those of us who don't go shopping a lot that we would love to give you a check in advance so that you can go shopping for us. But I'm sure you've worked it out before. You can work it out again, because it is a wonderful cause, and we want to all be able to chip in on it. And since it's going to go out to the whole county, some of us would probably prefer to donate a check for it so that we can get as many out there as we can. Thank you.
How many barrels do you have, Mr. Webster? Just one? Well, we can put one in the administration office too, if you like. Get a lot of traffic in there. Yeah. Very good. Thank you, Mr. Webster. Sure. Any other new business? Okay, we'll move on to announcements and communications. Ms. Clerk, Ms. Lori Gumbel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The items listed below were received as correspondence.
Very good. Is there any announcements or communications from board members? None? Okay, so this next week we'll be sending out a communication concerning redistricting, our plan, and the process going forward. So all the board members will receive that next week. Also, I want to say that the Sheriff's Department with Sheriff's Caruana will continue the daily administrative duties of the Coroner's office. That's been ongoing. They've identified areas of improvement, and I appreciate the work from the Sheriff's Department on that. And if anything changes, we'll let everybody know on that end. Any directors have any communications this evening? None? One last call for board members. None? Mr. Webster? Motion by Mr. Webster to adjourn, Mr. Girl and Mr. McCarthy's back there. Seconds, all in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.